read in the Bible the passage, "And if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be offended." In whatever direction Ivan struck, he would leave himself vulnerable on the other side. Only if he had absolute power could he deal with this many-headed hydra, and he had no such power. Ivan brooded until the morning of December 3rd, 1564, when the citizens of Moscow awoke to a strange sight. Hundreds of sleds filled the square before the Kremlin, loaded with the Tsar's treasures and with provisions for the entire court. They watched in disbelief as the Tsar and his court boarded the sleds and left town. Without explaining why, he established himself in a village south of Moscow. For an entire month, a kind of terror gripped the capital, for the Muscovites feared that Ivan had abandoned them to the bloodthirsty boyars. Shops closed up, and riotous mobs gathered daily. Finally, on January 3rd of 1565, a letter arrived from the Tsar, explaining that he could no longer bear the boyars' betrayals and had decided to abdicate once and for all. Read aloud in public, the letter had a startling effect. Merchants and commoners blamed the boyars for Ivan's decision and took to the streets, terrifying the nobility with their fury. Soon, a group of delegates representing the church, the princes, and the people made the journey to Ivan's village and begged the Tsar, in the name of the Holy Land of Russia, to return to the throne. Ivan listened, but would not change his mind. After days of hearing their pleas, however, he offered his subjects a choice. Either they grant him absolute powers to govern as he pleased, with no interference from the boyars, or they find a new leader. Faced with a choice between civil war and the acceptance of despotic power, almost every sector of Russian society opted for a strong Tsar, calling for Ivan's return to Moscow and the restoration of law and order. In February, with much celebration, Ivan returned to Moscow. The Russians could no longer complain if he behaved dictatorially. They had given him this power themselves. Interpretation. Withdrawal and disappearance are classic ways of controlling the options. You give people a sense of how things will fall apart without you, and you offer them a choice. I stay away, and you suffer the consequences, or I return under circumstances that I dictate. In this method of controlling people's options, they choose the option that gives you power because the alternative is just too unpleasant. You force their hand, but indirectly, they seem to have a choice. Whenever people feel they have a choice, they walk into your trap that much more easily. Keys to power. Words like freedom, options, and choice evoke a power of possibility far beyond the reality of the benefits they entail. When examined closely, the choices we have in the marketplace, in elections, in our jobs, tend to have noticeable limitations. They are often a matter of a choice simply between A and B, with the rest of the alphabet out of the picture. Yet, as long as the faintest mirage of choice flickers on, we rarely focus on the missing options. We choose to believe that the game is fair and that we have our freedom. We prefer not to think too much about the depth of our liberty to choose. This supplies the clever and cunning with enormous opportunities for deception. For people who are choosing between alternatives find it hard to believe they are being manipulated or deceived. They cannot see that you are allowing them a small amount of free will in exchange for a much more powerful imposition of your own will. Setting up a narrow range of choices, then, should always be a part of your deceptions. There is a saying, if you can get the bird to walk into the cage on its own, it will sing that much more prettily. The following are among the most common forms of controlling the options. Color the choices. This was a favored technique of Henry Kissinger. As President Nixon's Secretary of State, Kissinger considered himself better informed than his boss and believed that in most situations, he could make the best decision on his own. But if he tried to determine policy, he would offend, or perhaps enrage, a notoriously insecure man. So Kissinger would propose 3 or 4 choices of action for each situation, and would present them in such a way that the one he preferred always seemed the best solution compared to the others. Time after time, Nixon fell for the bait, never suspecting that he was moving where Kissinger pushed him. This is an excellent device to use on the insecure master. Force the resistor. This is a good technique to use on children and other willful people who enjoy doing the opposite of what you ask them to. Push them to choose what you want them to do by appearing to advocate the opposite. Alter the playing field. In the 1860s, John D. Rockefeller set out to create an oil monopoly. If he tried to buy up the smaller oil companies, they would figure out what he was doing and fight back. Instead, he began secretly buying up the railway companies that transported the oil. When he then attempted to take over a particular company and met with resistance, he reminded them of their dependence on the rails. Refusing them shipping or simply raising their fees could ruin their business. Rockefeller altered the playing field so that the only options the small oil producers had were the ones he gave them. In this tactic, your opponents know their hand is being forced, but it doesn't matter. The technique is effective against those who resist at all costs. The shrinking options. The late 19th century art dealer Ambrose Vollard perfected this technique. Customers would come to Vollard's shop to see some Cézannes. He would show 3 paintings, neglect to mention a price, and pretend to doze off. The visitors would have to leave without deciding. They would usually come back the next day to see the paintings again, but this time, Vollard would pull out less interesting works, pretending he thought they were the same ones. The baffled customers would look at the new offerings, leave to think them over, and return yet again. Once again, the same thing would happen. Vollard would show paintings of lesser quality still. Finally, the buyers would realize they had better grab what he was showing them because tomorrow they would have to settle for something worse, perhaps at even higher prices. A variation on this technique is to raise the price every time the buyer hesitates and another day goes by. This is an excellent negotiating ploy to use on the chronically indecisive who will fall for the idea that they are getting a better deal today than if they wait till tomorrow. The weak man on the precipice. The weak are the easiest to maneuver by controlling their options. Cardinal de Retz, the great 17th century provocateur, served as an unofficial assistant to the Duke of Orleans, who was notoriously indecisive. It was a constant struggle to convince the Duke to take action. He would hem and haw, weigh the options, and wait until the last moment, giving everyone around him an ulcer. But Retz discovered a way to handle him. He would describe all sorts of dangers, exaggerating them as much as possible, until the Duke saw a yawning abyss in every direction except one, the one Retz was pushing him to take. This tactic is similar to color the choices, but with the weak, you have to be more aggressive. Work on their emotions, use fear and terror to propel them into action. Try reason, and they will always find a way to procrastinate. The horns of a dilemma. This idea was demonstrated by General William Sherman's infamous march through Georgia during the American Civil War. Although the Confederates knew what direction Sherman was heading in, they never knew if he would attack from the left or the right, for he divided his army into 2 wings, and if the rebels retreated from one wing, they found themselves facing the other. This is a classic trial lawyer's technique. The lawyer leads the witness to decide between 2 possible explanations of an event, both of which poke a hole in their story. They have to answer the lawyer's questions, but whatever they say, they hurt themselves. The key to this move is to strike quickly, deny the victim the time to think of an escape. As they wriggle between the horns of the dilemma, they dig their own grave. Understand, in your struggles with your rivals, it will often be necessary for you to hurt them. And if you are clearly the agent of their punishment, expect a counterattack. Expect revenge. If, however, they seem to themselves to be the agents of their own misfortune, they will submit quietly. When Ivan left Moscow for his rural village, the citizens asking him to return agreed to his demand for absolute power. Over the years to come, they resented him less for the terror he unleashed on the country, because, after all, they had granted him his power themselves. This is why it is always good to allow your victims their choice of poison and to cloak your involvement in providing it to them as far as possible. Law 32. Play to people's fantasies. Judgment. The truth is often avoided because it is ugly and unpleasant. Never appeal to truth and reality unless you are prepared for the anger that comes from disenchantment. Life is so harsh and distressing that people who can manufacture romance or conjure up fantasy are like oases in the desert. Everyone flocks to them. There is great power in tapping into the fantasies of the masses. Observance of the law. The city-state of Venice was prosperous for so long that its citizens felt their small republic had destiny on its side. In the Middle Ages and High Renaissance, its virtual monopoly on trade to the east made it the wealthiest city in Europe. Under a beneficent republican government, Venetians enjoyed liberties that few other Italians had ever known. Yet, in the 16th century, their fortunes suddenly changed. The opening of the New World transferred power to the Atlantic side of Europe, to the Spanish and Portuguese, and later the Dutch and English. Venice could not compete economically, and its empire gradually dwindled. The final blow was the devastating loss of a prized Mediterranean possession, the island of Cyprus, captured from Venice by the Turks in 1570. Now, noble families went broke in Venice, and banks began to fold. A kind of gloom and desperation settled over the citizens. They had known a glittering past, had either lived through it or heard stories about it from their elders. The closeness of the glory years was humiliating. The Venetians half believed that the goddess Fortune was only playing a joke on them, and that the old days would soon return. For the time being, though, what could they do? In 1589, rumors began to swirl around Venice of the arrival not far away of a mysterious man called Il Bragadino, a master of alchemy, a man who had won incredible wealth through his ability. It was said to multiply gold through the use of a secret substance. The rumor spread quickly because a few years earlier, a Venetian nobleman passing through Poland had heard a learned man prophesy that Venice would recover her past glory and power if she could find a man who understood the alchemic art of manufacturing gold. And so, as word reached Venice of the gold this Bragadino possessed, he clinked gold coins continuously in his hands, and golden objects filled his palace. Some began to dream. Through him, their city would prosper again. Members of Venice's most important noble families accordingly went together to Brescia, where Bragadino lived. They toured his palace and watched in awe as he demonstrated his gold-making abilities, taking a pinch of seemingly worthless minerals and transforming it into several ounces of gold dust. The Venetian Senate prepared to debate the idea of extending an official invitation to Bragadino to stay in Venice at the city's expense, when word suddenly reached them that they were competing with the Duke of Mantua for his services. They heard of a magnificent party in Bragadino's palace for the Duke. featuring garments with golden buttons, gold watches, gold plates, and on and on. Worried they might lose Bragadino to Mantua, the Senate voted almost unanimously to invite him to Venice, promising him the mountain of money he would need to continue living in his luxurious style, but only if he came right away. Late that year, the mysterious Bragadino arrived in Venice. With his piercing dark eyes under thick brows, and the two enormous black mastiffs that accompanied him everywhere, he was forbidding and impressive. He took up residence in a sumptuous palace on the island of Giudecca, with the Republic funding his banquets, his expensive clothes, and all his other whims. A kind of alchemy fever spread through Venice. On street corners, hawkers would sell coal, distilling apparatus, bellows, how-to books on the subject. Everyone began to practice alchemy. Everyone except Bragadino. The alchemist seemed to be in no hurry to begin manufacturing the gold that would save Venice from ruin. Strangely enough, this only increased his popularity and following. People thronged from all over Europe, even Asia, to meet this remarkable man.
Bragadino.
Months went by, with gifts pouring in to Bragadino from all sides. Still, he gave no sign of the miracle that the Venetians confidently expected him to produce. Eventually, the citizens began to grow impatient, wondering if he would wait forever. At first, the senators warned them not to hurry him. He was a capricious devil who needed to be cajoled. Finally, though, the nobility began to wonder too, and the Senate came under pressure to show a return on the city's ballooning investment. Bragadino had only scorn for the doubters, but he responded to them. He had, he said, already deposited in the city's mint the mysterious substance with which he multiplied gold. He could use this substance up all at once and produce double the gold, but the more slowly the process took place, the more it would yield. If left alone for 7 years, sealed in a casket, the substance would multiply the gold in the mint 30 times over. Most of the senators agreed to wait to reap the gold mine Bragadino promised. Others, however, were angry. 7 more years of this man living royally at the public trough? And many of the common citizens of Venice echoed these sentiments. Finally, the alchemist's enemies demanded he produce a proof of his skills, a substantial amount of gold, and soon. Lofty, apparently devoted to his art, Bragadino responded that Venice, in its impatience, had betrayed him, and would therefore lose his services. He left town, going first to nearby Padua, then, in 1590, to Munich, at the invitation of the Duke of Bavaria, who, like the entire city of Venice, had known great wealth but had fallen into bankruptcy through his own profligacy, and hoped to regain his fortune through the famous alchemist's services. And so Bragadino resumed the comfortable arrangement he had known in Venice, and the same pattern repeated itself. Interpretation. The young Cypriot Mamounia had lived in Venice for several years before reincarnating himself as the alchemist Bragadino. He saw how gloom had settled on the city, how everyone was hoping for a redemption from some indefinite source. At first, Mamounia did not use vulgar demonstrations to convince people of his alchemic skill. His sumptuous palace, his opulent garments, the clink of gold in his hands, all these provided a superior argument to anything rational, and these established the cycle that kept him going. His obvious wealth confirmed his reputation as an alchemist, so that patrons like the Duke of Mantua gave him money, which allowed him to live in wealth, which reinforced his reputation as an alchemist, and so on. Only once this reputation was established, and dukes and senators were fighting over him, did he resort to the trifling necessity of a demonstration. By then, however, people were easy to deceive. They wanted to believe. The Venetian senators who watched him multiply gold wanted to believe so badly that they failed to notice the glass pipe up his sleeve from which he slipped gold dust into his pinches of minerals. Brilliant and capricious, he was the alchemist of their fantasies, and once he had created an aura like this, no one noticed his simple deceptions. People rarely believe that their problems arise from their own misdeeds and stupidity. Someone or something out there is to blame. The other, the world, the gods. And so, salvation comes from the outside as well. Had Bragadino arrived in Venice armed with a detailed analysis of the reasons behind the city's economic decline, and of the hard-nosed steps that it could take to turn things around, he would have been scorned. The reality was too ugly, and the solution too painful. Mostly the kind of hard work that the citizens' ancestors had mustered to create an empire. Fantasy, on the other hand, in this case the romance of alchemy, was easy to understand and infinitely more palatable. To gain power, you must be a source of pleasure for those around you, and pleasure comes from playing to people's fantasies. Never promise a gradual improvement through hard work. Rather, promise the moon, the great and sudden transformation, the pot of gold. Keys to power. Fantasy can never operate alone. It requires the backdrop of the humdrum and the mundane. It is the oppressiveness of reality that allows fantasy to take root and bloom. In 16th century Venice, the reality was one of decline and loss of prestige. The corresponding fantasy described a sudden recovery of past glories through the miracle of alchemy. While the reality only got worse, the Venetians inhabited a happy dream world in which their city restored its fabulous wealth and power overnight, turning dust into gold. The person who can spin a fantasy out of an oppressive reality has access to untold power. As you search for the fantasy that will take hold of the masses, then, keep your eye on the banal truths that weigh heavily on us all. Never be distracted by people's glamorous portraits of themselves and their lives. Search and dig for what really imprisons them. Once you find that, you have the magical key that will put great power in your hands. Remember, the key to fantasy is distance. The distant has allure and promise, seems simple and problem-free. What are you offering then should be ungraspable. Never let it become oppressively familiar. It is the mirage in the distance, withdrawing as the sucker approaches. Never be too direct in describing the fantasy. Keep it vague. As a forger of fantasies, let your victim come close enough to see and be tempted, but keep him far away enough that he stays dreaming and desiring. Law 33. Discover each man's thumbscrew. Judgment. Everyone has a weakness, a gap in the castle wall. That weakness is usually an insecurity, an uncontrollable emotion or need. It can also be a small, secret pleasure. Either way, once found, it is a thumbscrew you can turn to your advantage. Finding the thumbscrew, a strategic plan of action. We all have resistances. We live with a perpetual armor around ourselves to defend against change and the intrusive actions of friends and rivals. We would like nothing more than to be left to do things our own way. Constantly butting up against these resistances will cost you a lot of energy. One of the most important things to realize about people, though, is that they all have a weakness, some part of their psychological armor that will not resist, that will bend to your will if you find it and push on it. Some people wear their weaknesses openly, others disguise them. Those who disguise them are often the ones most effectively undone through that one chink in their armor. In planning your assault, keep these principles in mind. Pay attention to gestures and unconscious signals. As Sigmund Freud remarked, no mortal can keep a secret. If his lips are silent, he chatters with his fingertips. Betrayal oozes out of him at every pore. This is a critical concept in the search for a person's weakness. It is revealed by seemingly unimportant gestures and passing words. The key is not only what you look for, but where and how you look. Everyday conversation supplies the richest mine of weaknesses, so train yourself to listen. Start by always seeming interested. The appearance of a sympathetic ear will spur anyone to talk. A clever trick, often used by the 19th century French statesman Talleyrand, is to appear to open up to the other person, to share a secret with them. It can be completely made up, or it can be real, but of no great importance to you. The important thing is that it should seem to come from the heart. This will usually elicit a response that is not only as frank as yours, but more genuine, a response that reveals a weakness. If you suspect that someone has a particular soft spot, probe for it indirectly. If, for instance, you sense that a man has a need to be loved, openly flatter him. If he laps up your compliments, no matter how obvious, you are on the right track. Train your eye for details, how someone tips a waiter, what delights a person, the hidden messages in clothes. Find people's idols, the things they worship and will do anything to get. Perhaps you can be the supplier of their fantasies. Find the helpless child. Most weaknesses begin in childhood, before the self builds up compensatory defenses. Perhaps the child was pampered or indulged in a particular area, or perhaps a certain emotional need went unfulfilled. As he or she grows older, the indulgence or the deficiency may be buried, but never disappears. Knowing about a childhood need gives you a powerful key to a person's weakness. One sign of this weakness is that when you touch on it, the person will often act like a child. Be on the lookout, then, for any behavior that should have been outgrown. If your victims or rivals went without something important, such as parental support when they were children, supply it, or its facsimile. If they reveal a secret taste, a hidden indulgence, indulge it. In either case, they will be unable to resist you. Look for contrasts. An overt trait often conceals its opposite. People who thump their chests are often big cowards. A prudish exterior may hide a lascivious soul. The uptight are often screaming for adventure. The shy are dying for attention. By probing beyond appearances, you will often find people's weaknesses in the opposite of the qualities they reveal to you. Find the weak link. Sometimes in your search for weaknesses, it is not what, but who that matters. In today's versions of the court, there is often someone behind the scenes who has a great deal of power, a tremendous influence over the person superficially on top. These behind-the-scenes power brokers are the group's weak link. Win their favor, and you indirectly influence the king. Alternatively, even in a group of people acting with the appearance of one will, as when a group under attack closes ranks to resist an outsider, there is always a weak link in the chain. Find the one person who will bend under pressure. Fill the void. The two main emotional voids to fill are insecurity and unhappiness. The insecure are suckers for any kind of social validation. As for the chronically unhappy, look for the roots of their unhappiness. The insecure and the unhappy are the people least able to disguise their weaknesses. The ability to fill their emotional voids is a great source of power and an indefinitely prolongable one. Feed on uncontrollable emotions. The uncontrollable emotion can be a paranoid fear, a fear disproportionate to the situation, or any base motive such as lust, greed, vanity, or hatred. People in the grip of these emotions often cannot control themselves, and you can do the controlling for them. Observance of the law. Arabella Huntington, wife of the great late 19th century railroad magnate Collis P. Huntington, came from humble origins and always struggled for social recognition among her wealthy peers. When she gave a party in her San Francisco mansion, few of the social elite would show up. Most of them took her for a gold digger, not their kind. Because of her husband's fabulous wealth, art dealers courted her, but with such condescension, they obviously saw her as an upstart. Only one man of consequence treated her differently, the dealer Joseph Duveen. For the first few years of Duveen's relationship with Arabella, he made no effort to sell expensive art to her. Instead, he accompanied her to fine stores, chatted endlessly about queens and princesses he knew, on and on. At last, she thought, a man who treated her as an equal, even a superior, in high society. Meanwhile, if Duveen did not try to sell art to her, he did subtly educate her in his aesthetic ideas, namely, that the best art was the most expensive art. And after Arabella had soaked up his way of seeing things, Duveen would act as if she always had exquisite taste, even though before she met him, her aesthetics had been abysmal. When Collis Huntington died in 1900, Arabella came into a fortune. She suddenly started to buy expensive paintings, by Rembrandt and Velázquez, for example, and only from Duveen. Years later, Duveen sold her Gainsborough's Blue Boy for the highest price ever paid for a work of art at the time, an astounding purchase for a family that previously had shown little interest in collecting. Interpretation. Joseph Duveen instantly understood Arabella Huntington and what made her tick. She wanted to feel important, at home in society. Intensely insecure about her lower-class background, she needed confirmation of her new social status. Duveen waited. Instead of rushing into trying to persuade her to collect art, he suddenly went to work on her weaknesses. He made her feel that she deserved his attention, not because she was the wife of one of the wealthiest men in the world, but because of her own special character, and this completely melted her. Duveen never condescended to Arabella. Rather than lecturing to her, he instilled his ideas in her indirectly. The result was one of his best and most devoted clients, and also the sale of the Blue Boy. People's need for validation and recognition, their need to feel important, is the best kind of weakness to exploit. First, it is almost universal. Second, exploiting it is so very easy. All you have to do is find ways to make people feel better about their taste, their social standing, their intelligence. Once the fish are hooked, you can reel them in again and again for years. You are filling a positive role, giving them what they cannot get on their own. They may never suspect that you are turning them like a thumbscrew, and if they do, they may not care, because you are making them feel better about themselves, and that is worth any price. Law 34. Be royal in your own fashion. Act like a king to be treated like one.
Good.
Judgment. The way you carry yourself will often determine how you are treated. In the long run, appearing vulgar or common will make people disrespect you. For a king respects himself and inspires the same sentiment in others. By acting regally and confident of your powers, you make yourself seem destined to wear a crown. Observance of the law. When Christopher Columbus was trying to find funding for his legendary voyages, many around him believed he came from the Italian aristocracy. This view was passed into history through a biography written after the explorer's death by his son, which describes him as a descendant of a Count Colombo of the castle of Cuccaro in Montferrat. Colombo, in turn, was said to be descended from the legendary Roman general Colonius, and two of his first cousins were supposedly direct descendants of an emperor of Constantinople. An illustrious background indeed. But it was nothing more than illustrious fantasy, for Columbus was actually the son of Domenico Colombo, a humble weaver who had opened a wine shop when Christopher was a young man, and who then made his living by selling cheese. Columbus himself had created the myth of his noble background, because from early on he felt that destiny had singled him out for great things, and that he had a kind of royalty in his blood. Accordingly, he acted as if he were indeed descended from noble stock. After an uneventful career as a merchant on a commercial vessel, Columbus, originally from Genoa, settled in Lisbon. Using the fabricated story of his noble background, he married into an established Lisbon family that had excellent connections with Portuguese royalty. Through his in-laws, Columbus finagled a meeting with the King of Portugal, João II, whom he petitioned to finance a westward voyage aimed at discovering a shorter route to Asia. In return for announcing that any discoveries he achieved would be made in the king's name, Columbus wanted a series of rights: the title Grand Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the office of Viceroy over any lands he found, and 10% of the future commerce with such lands. All of these were to be hereditary and for all time. Columbus made these demands even though he had previously been a mere merchant. He knew almost nothing about navigation. He could not work a quadrant, and he had never led a group of men. In short, he had absolutely no qualifications for the journey he proposed. Furthermore, his petition included no details as to how he would accomplish his plans, just vague promises. When Columbus finished his pitch, João II smiled. He politely declined the offer, but left the door open for the future. Here Columbus must have noticed something he would never forget. Even as the king turned down the sailors' demands, he treated them as legitimate. He neither laughed at Columbus nor questioned his background and credentials. In fact, the king was impressed by the boldness of Columbus's requests, and clearly felt comfortable in the company of a man who acted so confidently. The meeting must have convinced Columbus that his instincts were correct. By asking for the moon, he had instantly raised his own status, for the king assumed that unless a man who set such a high price on himself were mad, which Columbus did not appear to be, he must somehow be worth it. A few years later, Columbus moved to Spain. Using his Portuguese connections, he moved in elevated circles at the Spanish court, receiving subsidies from illustrious financiers and sharing tables with dukes and princes. To all these men, he repeated his request for financing for a voyage to the west, and also for the rights he had demanded from João II. Some, such as the powerful Duke of Medina, wanted to help, but could not, since they lacked the power to grant him the titles and rights he wanted. But Columbus would not back down. He soon realized that only one person could meet his demands: Queen Isabella. In 1487, he finally managed a meeting with the Queen, and although he could not convince her to finance the voyage, he completely charmed her and became a frequent guest in the palace. In 1492, the Spanish finally expelled the Moorish invaders who centuries earlier had seized parts of the country. With the wartime burden on her treasury lifted, Isabella felt she could finally respond to the demands of her explorer friend, and she decided to pay for 3 ships, equipment, the salaries of the crews, and a modest stipend for Columbus. More important, she had a contract drawn up that granted Columbus the titles and rights on which he had insisted. The only one she denied, and only in the contract's fine print, was the 10% of all revenues from any lands discovered, an absurd demand, since he wanted no time limit on it. Had the clause been left in, it would eventually have made Columbus and his heirs the wealthiest family on the planet. Columbus never read the fine print. Satisfied that his demands had been met, Columbus set sail that same year in search of the passage to Asia. Before he left, he was careful to hire the best navigator he could find to help get him there. The mission failed to find such a passage, yet when Columbus petitioned the Queen to finance an even more ambitious voyage the following year, she agreed. By then, she had come to see Columbus as destined for great things. Interpretation. Columbus had an amazing power to charm the nobility, and it all came from the way he carried himself. He projected a sense of confidence that was completely out of proportion to his means. Nor was his confidence the aggressive, ugly self-promotion of an upstart. It was a quiet and calm self-assurance. In fact, it was the same confidence usually shown by the nobility themselves. The powerful in the old-style aristocracies felt no need to prove or assert themselves. Being noble, they knew they always deserved more, and asked for it. With Columbus, then, they felt an instant affinity, for he carried himself just the way they did, elevated above the crowd, destined for greatness. Understand, it is within your power to set your own price. How you carry yourself reflects what you think of yourself. If you ask for little, shuffle your feet, and lower your head, people will assume this reflects your character. But this behavior is not you. It is only how you have chosen to present yourself to other people. You can just as easily present the Columbus front, buoyancy, confidence, and the feeling that you were born to wear a crown. Keys to power. As children, we start our lives with great exuberance, expecting and demanding everything from the world. This generally carries over into our first forays into society as we begin our careers. But as we grow older, the rebuffs and failures we experience set up boundaries that only get firmer with time. Coming to expect less from the world, we accept limitations that are really self-imposed. We start to bow and scrape and apologize for even the simplest of requests. The solution to such a shrinking of horizons is to deliberately force ourselves in the opposite direction, to downplay the failures and ignore the limitations, to make ourselves demand and expect as much as the child. To accomplish this, we must use a particular strategy upon ourselves. Call it the strategy of the crown. The strategy of the crown is based on a simple chain of cause and effect. If we believe we are destined for great things, our belief will radiate outward just as a crown creates an aura around a king. This outward radiance will infect the people around us who will think we must have reasons to feel so confident. People who wear crowns seem to feel no inner sense of the limits to what they can ask for or what they can accomplish. This too radiates outward. Limits and boundaries disappear. Use the strategy of the crown, and you will be surprised how often it bears fruit. Take as an example those happy children who ask for whatever they want and get it. Their high expectations are their charm. Adults enjoy granting their wishes, just as Isabella enjoyed granting the wishes of Columbus. Law 35. Master the art of timing. Judgment. Never seem to be in a hurry. Hurrying betrays a lack of control over yourself and over time. Always seem patient, as if you know that everything will come to you eventually. Become a detective of the right moment. Sniff out the spirit of the times, the trends that will carry you to power. Learn to stand back when the time is not yet ripe, and to strike fiercely when it has reached fruition. Observance of the law. Starting out in life as a nondescript French seminary school teacher, Joseph Fouché wandered from town to town for most of the decade of the 1780s, teaching mathematics to young boys. Yet, he never completely committed himself to the church, never took his vows as a priest. He had bigger plans. Patiently waiting for his chance, he kept his options open. And when the French Revolution broke out in 1789, Fouché waited no longer. He got rid of his cassock, grew his hair long, and became a revolutionary. For this was the spirit of the times. To miss the boat at this critical moment could have spelt disaster. Fouché did not miss the boat. Befriending the revolutionary leader Robespierre, he quickly rose in the rebel ranks. In 1792, the town of Nantes elected Fouché to be its representative to the National Convention, created that year to frame a new constitution for a French republic.
Like and
When
share,
Fouché
please,
arrived
like
in
and
Paris
share.
to take his seat at the
Let me talk,
convention,
come back
a
here.
violent rift had broken out between the
Observe the law.
moderates and the radical Jacobins. Fouché sensed that in the long run, neither
Thanks for
side would
sharing
emerge
my life.
victorious. Power rarely ends up in the hands of those who start a revolution or even of those who further it. Power sticks to those who bring it to a conclusion. That was the side Fouché wanted to be on. His sense of timing was uncanny. He started as a moderate, for moderates were in the majority. When the time came to decide on whether or not to execute Louis XVI, however, he saw that the people were clamoring for the king's head. So he cast the deciding vote for the guillotine. Now he had become a radical. Yet, as tensions came to the boil in Paris, he foresaw the danger of being too closely associated with any one faction. So he accepted a position in the provinces where he could lay low for a while. A few
Like
months
and share,
later, he
please,
was
like
assigned to
and
the post
share.
of proconsul in Lyon, where he oversaw the execution of dozens of aristocrats. At a certain moment, however, he called a halt to the killings, sensing that the mood of the country was turning. And despite the blood already on his hands, the citizens of Lyon hailed him as a savior from what had become known as the Terror. So far, Fouché had played his cards brilliantly. But in 1794, his old friend Robespierre recalled him to Paris to account for his actions in Lyon. Robespierre had been the driving force behind the Terror. He had sent heads on both the right and the left rolling, and Fouché, whom he no longer trusted, seemed destined to provide the next head. Over the next few weeks, a tense struggle ensued, while Robespierre railed openly against Fouché, accusing him of dangerous ambitions and calling for his arrest. The crafty Fouché worked more indirectly, quietly gaining support among those who were beginning to tire of Robespierre's dictatorial control. Fouché was playing for time. He knew that the longer he survived, the more disaffected citizens he could rally against Robespierre. He had to have broad support before he moved against the powerful leader. He rallied support among both the moderates and the Jacobins, playing on the widespread fear of Robespierre. Everyone was afraid of being the next to go to the guillotine. It all came to fruition on July 27th. The convention turned against Robespierre, shouting down his usual lengthy speech. He was quickly arrested, and a few days later it was Robespierre's head, not Fouché's, that fell into the basket. When Fouché returned to the convention after Robespierre's death, he played his most unexpected move. Having led the conspiracy against Robespierre, he was expected to sit with the moderates. But, lo and behold, he once again changed sides, joining the radical Jacobins. For perhaps the first time in his life, he aligned himself with the minority. Clearly, he sensed a reaction stirring. He knew that the moderate faction that had executed Robespierre and was now about to take power would initiate a new round of the Terror, this time against the radicals. In siding with the Jacobins then, Fouché was sitting with the martyrs of the days to come, the people who would be considered blameless in the troubles that were on their way. Taking sides with what was about to become the losing team was a risky gambit, of course, but Fouché must have calculated he could keep his head long enough to quietly stir up the populace against the moderates and watch them fall from power. And indeed, although the moderates did call for his arrest in December of 1795 and would have sent him to the guillotine, too much time had passed. The executions had become unpopular with the people, and Fouché survived the swing of the pendulum one more time. A new government took over, the Directoire. It was not, however, a Jacobin government, but a moderate one, more moderate than the government that had reimposed the terror. Fouché, the radical, had kept his head, but now he had to keep a low profile. He waited patiently on the sidelines for several years, allowing time to soften any bitter feelings against him. Then he approached the Directoire and convinced them he had a new passion, intelligence gathering. He became a paid spy for the government, excelled at the job, and in 1799 was rewarded by being made Minister of Police. Now he was not just empowered, but required to extend his spying to every corner of France, a responsibility that would greatly reinforce his natural ability to sniff out where the wind was blowing. One of the first social trends he detected, in fact, came in the person of Napoleon, a brash young general whose destiny he right away saw was entwined with the future of France. When Napoleon unleashed a coup d'etat on November 9, 1799, Fouché pretended to be asleep. Indeed, he slept the whole day. For this indirect assistance, it might have been thought his job, after all, to prevent a military coup. Napoleon kept him on as Minister of Police in the new regime. Over the next few years, Napoleon came to rely on Fouché more and more. He even gave this former revolutionary a title, Duke of Otranto, and rewarded him with great wealth. By 1808, however, Fouché, always attuned to the times, sensed that Napoleon was on the downswing. His feudal war with Spain, a country that posed no threat to France, was a sign that he was losing a sense of proportion. Never one to be caught on a sinking ship, Fouché conspired with Talleyrand to bring about Napoleon's downfall. Although the conspiracy failed, Talleyrand was fired. Fouché stayed, but was kept on a tight leash. It publicized a growing discontent with the emperor, who seemed to be losing control. By 1814, Napoleon's power had crumbled, and Allied forces finally conquered him. The next government was a restoration of the monarchy in the form of King Louis XVIII, brother of Louis XVI. Fouché, his nose always sniffing the air for the next social shift, knew Louis would not last long. He had none of Napoleon's flair. Fouché once again played his waiting game, laying low, staying away from the spotlight. Sure enough, in February of 1815, Napoleon escaped from the island of Elba, where he had been imprisoned. Louis XVIII panicked. His policies had alienated the citizenry who were clamoring for Napoleon's return. So Louis turned to the one man who could maybe have saved his hide, Fouché, the former radical who had sent his brother Louis XVI to the guillotine, but was now one of the most popular and widely admired politicians in France. Fouché, however, would not side with a loser. He refused Louis's request for help by pretending that his help was unnecessary, by swearing that Napoleon would never return to power, although he knew otherwise. A short time later, of course, Napoleon and his new citizen army were closing in on Paris. Seeing his reign about to collapse, feeling that Fouché had betrayed him, and certain that he did not want this powerful and able man on Napoleon's team, King Louis ordered the minister's arrest and execution. On March 16, 1815, policemen surrounded Fouché's coach on a Paris boulevard. Was this finally his end? Perhaps, but not immediately. Fouché told the police that an ex-member of government could not be arrested on the street. They fell for the story and allowed him to return home. Later that day, though, they came to his house and once again declared him under arrest. Fouché nodded, but would the officers be so kind as allow a gentleman to wash and to change his clothes before leaving his house for the last time? They gave their permission. Fouché left the room, and the minutes went by. Fouché did not return. Finally, the policemen went into the next room, where they saw a ladder against an open window leading down to the garden below. That day and the next, the police combed Paris for Fouché, but by then, Napoleon's cannons were audible in the distance, and the king and all the king's men had to flee the city. As soon as Napoleon entered Paris, Fouché came out of hiding. He had cheated the executioner once again. Napoleon greeted his former minister of police and gladly restored him to his old post. During the 100 days that Napoleon remained in power, until Waterloo, it was essentially Fouché who governed France. After Napoleon fell, Louis XVIII returned to the throne, and like a cat with 9 lives, Fouché stayed on to serve in yet another government. By then, his power and influence had grown so great that not even the king dared challenge him. Interpretation. In a period of unprecedented turmoil, Joseph Fouché thrived through his mastery of the art of timing. He teaches us a number of key lessons. First, it is critical to recognize the spirit of the times. Fouché always looked 2 steps ahead, found the wave that would carry him to power, and rode it. You must always work with the times, anticipate their twists and turns, and never miss the boat. Sometimes the spirit of the times is obscure. Recognize it not by what is loudest and most obvious in it, but by what lies hidden and dormant. Look forward to the Napoleons of the future rather than holding on to the ruins of the past. Second, recognizing the prevailing winds does not necessarily mean running with them. Any potent social movement creates a powerful reaction, and it is wise to anticipate what that reaction will be, as Fouché did after the execution of Robespierre. Rather than ride the cresting wave of the moment, wait for the tide's ebb to carry you back to power. Upon occasion, bet on the reaction that is brewing and place yourself in the vanguard of it. Finally, Fouché had remarkable patience. Without patience as your sword and shield, your timing will fail, and you will inevitably find yourself a loser. When the times were against Fouché, he did not struggle, get emotional, or strike out rashly.
Good.
He kept his cool and maintained a low profile, patiently building support among the citizenry, the bulwark in his next rise to power. Whenever he found himself in the weaker position, he played for time, which he knew would always be his ally if he was patient. Recognize the moment then, to hide in the grass or slither under a rock, as well as the moment to bare your fangs and attack. Keys to power. There are 3 kinds of time for us to deal with. Each presents problems that can be solved with skill and patience. First, there is long time, the drawn-out, years-long kind of time that must be managed with patience and gentle guidance. Our handling of long time should be mostly defensive. This is the art of not reacting impulsively, of waiting for opportunity.
Good.
Next, there is forced time, the short time that we can manipulate as an offensive weapon, upsetting the timing of our opponent. Finally, there is end time, when a plan must be executed with speed and force. We have waited, found the moment, and must not hesitate.
Ronnie.
Long time,
Give thanks.
When you force the pace out of fear and impatience, you create a nest of problems that require fixing, and you end up taking much longer than if you had taken your time. Hurriers may occasionally get there quicker, but papers fly everywhere, new dangers arise, and they find themselves in constant crisis mode, fixing the problems that they themselves have created. Sometimes, not acting in the face of danger is your best move. You wait. You deliberately slow down. As time passes, it will eventually present opportunities you had not imagined. Waiting involves controlling not only your own emotions, but those of your colleagues who, mistaking action for power, may try to push you into making rash moves. In your rivals, on the other hand, you can encourage this same mistake if you let them rush headlong into trouble while you stand back and wait. You will soon find.
For those who just come on, we are observing the 48th law of power. You know what I mean? The 48th law of power, what the leaders of the world are using to manipulate the people all over the years. You understand? So it may sound like a story, but after they give you the name of the laws, then they give you scientific fact, things that have been proven in history. You understand? And then them talk about the key, the power key that you can use to better your life. Not to violate the law by oppressing people like what Babylon doing on like leaders of the world, but to use it in the right for you to stay powerful in the right way and balancing at the right frequency. You understand? So blessed love everyone. Me I be gonna please if you can. When the tag on, me can't tell you if you like and share, because it go disturb the audio. You see me I say, so as you forward and does, if it's even 2 persons, just share it. Share and go and tap up the screen and you bring me on 10,000, like, cause nothing, You see what I say? See me take all the time out just for go through the law them would do. You see me the 48 law of power, man, or every rich wealthy man in the earth I use to survive today, man. Just find it in our heart, you know what I mean? That's like and share it, Because if the older we get the knowledge, we have a better world and a better place. And I do want to live in a better world and a better place. A world where me can left my door all open, can be sure that my family and my kids, my great-grandkids and grandkids can be okay. You know what I mean? So we don't have to worry. We need to remove crime and violence from among us, ourselves, because we're only killing ourselves. We're only destroying ourselves. The enemies are so wise now that they don't have to kill us themselves anymore. Them designs, it's systematic. Them use the food, the weaponized food, the weaponized the movies that we watch, the weaponized sex, the weaponized liquor, the weaponized alcohol, the weaponized we destroy ourselves. So the 48 law of power is very important for everyone to know. You understand? So as you come on, like and share, man. Like and share, man. Like and share. Each one reach one, each one teach one. You understand me? I say, blessed love, more light to your light, more power to your power, more moderation to your darkness. You understand me? I say, because you have to know about the darkness and you have to know about the light. Because the world is balanced with negative and positive. So you can't just want to be positive and don't know the next side. You don't have to use the evil, but know about the evil side too. You understand? Now when a man approach you with deceptive codes, you smile because you see him from way out. You understand me? I say? So like and share, man. Like and share, brethren, because you might look, you see that something here? Wanna listen to? The way this thing is powerful. You see this morning when time me in it and I go through it, we don't know. My doors off in between sleep and awake. Yeah? And it's a great warrior that come vision me in a spirit, come visit me, And I tell me, say, yo, you're one of them, And me for come in at the heights, and me I say, yo, me nah go over there, say, Me satisfied there, so with me there. You understand me I say? Yeah, man, I'm moderation, man. So me I say, more light to your light. You think me I say, more power to your power. More moderation to your darkness. Means say, more balance. You see me I say? Yeah, we're going right. Like and share, man.
Moments to intervene and pick up the pieces. You do not deliberately slow time down to live longer or to take more pleasure in the moment, but the better to play the game of power. First, when your mind is uncluttered by constant emergencies, you will see further into the future. Second, you will be able to resist the baits that people dangle in front of you, and will keep yourself from becoming another impatient sucker. Third, you will have more room to be flexible. Opportunities will inevitably arise that you had not expected and would have missed had you forced the pace. Fourth, you will not move from one deal to the next without completing the first one. To build your power's foundation can take years. Make sure that foundation is secure. Do not be a flash in the pan. Success that is built up slowly and surely is the only kind that lasts. Forced time. The trick in forcing time is to upset the timing of others, to make them hurry, to make them wait, to make them abandon their own pace, to distort their perception of time. By upsetting the timing of your opponent while you stay patient, you open up time for yourself, which is half the game. Making people wait is a powerful way of forcing time, as long as they do not figure out what you are up to. You control the clock. They linger in limbo and rapidly come unglued, opening up opportunities for you to strike. The opposite effect is equally powerful. You make your opponents hurry, start off your dealings with them slowly, then suddenly apply pressure, making them feel that everything is happening at once. People who lack the time to think will make mistakes, so set their deadlines for them.
Code.
This was the technique Machiavelli admired in Cesare Borgia, who, during negotiations, would suddenly press vehemently for a decision, upsetting his opponent's timing and patience. For who would dare make Cesare wait? End time. You can play the game with the utmost artistry, waiting patiently for the right moment to act, putting your competitors off their form by messing with their timing. But it won't mean a thing unless you know how to finish. Do not be one of those people who look like paragons of patience, but are actually just afraid to bring things to a close. Patience is worthless unless combined with a willingness to fall ruthlessly on your opponent at the right moment. You can wait as long as necessary for the conclusion to come, but when it comes, it must come quickly. Use speed to paralyze your opponent, cover up any mistakes you might make, and impress people with your aura of authority and finality. With the patience of a snake charmer, you draw the snake out with calm and steady rhythms. Once the snake is out, though, would you dangle your foot above its deadly head? There is never a good reason to allow the slightest hitch in your endgame. Your mastery of timing can really only be judged by how you work with end time, how you quickly change the pace and bring things to a swift and definitive conclusion.
Code.
Law 36. Disdain things you cannot have. Ignoring them is the best revenge. Judgment. By acknowledging a petty problem, you give it existence and credibility. The more attention you pay an enemy, the stronger you make him. And a small mistake is often made worse and more visible when you try to fix it. It is sometimes best to leave things alone. If there is something you want but cannot have, show contempt for it. The less interest you reveal, the more superior you seem. Observance of the law. In the year 1527, King Henry VIII of England decided he had to find a way to get rid of his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine had failed to produce a son, a male heir who would ensure the continuance of his dynasty, and Henry thought he knew why. He had read in the Bible the passage, "And if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless." Before marrying Henry, Catherine had married his older brother Arthur, but Arthur had died 5 months later.
Good.
Henry had waited an appropriate time, then had married his brother's widow. Catherine was the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, and by marrying her, Henry had kept alive a valuable alliance. Now, however, Catherine had to assure him that her brief marriage with Arthur had never been consummated. Otherwise, Henry would view their relationship as incestuous and their marriage as null and void. Catherine insisted that she had remained a virgin through her marriage to Arthur, and Pope Clement VII supported her by giving his blessing to the union, which he could not have done had he considered it incestuous. Yet, after years of marriage to Henry, Catherine had failed to produce a son, and in the early 1520s she had entered menopause. To the king, this could only mean one thing. She had lied about her virginity. Their union was incestuous, and God had punished them.
Good.
There was another reason why Henry wanted to get rid of Catherine. He had fallen in love with a younger woman, Anne Boleyn. Not only was he in love with her, but if he married her, he could still hope to sire a legitimate son. The marriage to Catherine had to be annulled. For this, however, Henry had to apply to the Vatican. But Pope Clement would never annul their marriage.
What?
By the summer of 1527, rumors spread throughout Europe that Henry was about to attempt the impossible, to annul his marriage against Clement's wishes. Catherine would never abdicate, let alone voluntarily enter a nunnery, as Henry had urged her. But Henry had his own strategy. He stopped sleeping in the same bed with Catherine, since he considered her his sister-in-law, not his lawful wife. He insisted on calling her Princess Dowager of Wales, her title as Arthur's widow. Finally, in 1531, he banished her from court and shipped her off to a distant castle. The Pope ordered him to return her to court on pain of excommunication, the most severe penalty a Catholic could suffer. Henry not only ignored this threat, he insisted that his marriage to Catherine had been dissolved, and in 1533 he married Anne Boleyn. Clement refused to recognize the marriage, but Henry did not care. He no longer recognized the Pope's authority and proceeded to break with the Roman Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England in its stead, with the king as the head of the new church. And so, not surprisingly, the newly formed Church of England proclaimed Anne Boleyn England's rightful queen. The Pope tried every threat in the book, but nothing worked.
You hear?
Henry simply ignored him. Clement fumed. No one had ever treated him so contemptuously.
Violate the laws of God.
Henry had humiliated him, and he had no power of recourse. Even excommunication, which he constantly threatened, but never carried out, would no longer matter. Catherine, too, felt the devastating sting of Henry's disdain. She tried to fight back, but in appealing to Henry, her words fell on deaf ears, and soon they fell on no one's. Isolated from the court, ignored by the king, mad with anger and frustration, Catherine slowly deteriorated, and finally died in January of 1536 from a cancerous tumor of the heart. Interpretation. When you pay attention to a person, the two of you become partners of sorts, each moving in step to the actions and reactions of the other. In the process, you lose your initiative. It is a dynamic of all interactions. By acknowledging other people, even if only to fight with them, you open yourself to their influence. Had Henry locked horns with Catherine, he would have found himself mired in endless arguments that would have weakened his resolve and eventually worn him down. Had he set out to convince Clement to change his verdict on the marriage's validity, or tried to compromise and negotiate with him, he would have gotten bogged down in Clement's favorite tactic, playing for time, promising flexibility, but actually getting what popes always got, their way. Henry would have none of this. He played a devastating power game, total disdain. By ignoring people, you cancel them out. This unsettles and infuriates them, but since they have no dealings with you, there is nothing they can do. This is the offensive aspect of the law. Playing the card of contempt is immensely powerful, for it lets you determine the conditions of the conflict. The war is waged on your terms. This is the ultimate power pose. You are the king, and you ignore what offends you. Watch how this tactic infuriates people. Half of what they do is to get your attention, and when you withhold it from them, they flounder in frustration. Keys to power. If choosing to ignore enhances your power, it follows that the opposite approach, commitment and engagement, often weakens you. By paying undue attention to a puny enemy, you look puny. And the longer it takes you to crush such an enemy, the larger the enemy seems. When Athens set out to conquer the island of Sicily in 415 BC, a giant power was attacking a tiny one. Yet by entangling Athens in a long, drawn-out conflict, Syracuse, Sicily's most important city-state, was able to grow in stature and confidence. Finally, defeating Athens, it made itself famous for centuries to come. In recent times, President John F. Kennedy made a similar mistake in his attitude to Fidel Castro of Cuba. His failed invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961 made Castro an international hero. When you are attacked by an inferior, deflect people's attention by making it clear that the attack has not even registered. Look away, or answer sweetly, showing how little the attack concerns you. Similarly, when you yourself have committed a blunder, the best response is often to make less of your mistake by treating it lightly. Remember, the powerful responses to niggling, petty annoyances, and irritations are contempt and disdain. Never show that something has affected you or that you are offended. That only shows you have acknowledged a problem. Contempt is a dish that is best served cold and without affection.
Master your emotions.
Law 37. Create compelling spectacles. Judgment. Striking imagery and grand symbolic gestures create the aura of power. Everyone responds to them. Stage spectacles for those around you. Then, full of arresting visuals and radiant symbols that heighten your presence. Dazzled by appearances, no one will notice what you are really doing. Observance of the law. In 1536, the future king, Henry II of France, took his first mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Diane was 37 at the time, and was the widow of the Grand Seneschal of Normandy. Henry, meanwhile, was a sprightly lad of 17, who was just beginning to sow his wild oats. At first, their union seemed merely platonic, with Henry showing an intensely spiritual devotion to Diane. But it soon became clear that he loved her in every way, preferring her bed to that of his young wife, Catherine de' Medici. In 1547, King Francis died, and Henry ascended to the throne. This new situation posed perils for Diane de Poitiers. She had just turned 48, and despite her notorious cold baths and rumored youth potions, she was beginning to show her age. Now that Henry was king, perhaps he would return to the queen's bed, and do as other kings had done, choose mistresses from the bevy of beauties who made the French court the envy of Europe.
Like and share, please.
He was, after all, only 28, and cut a dashing figure. But Diane did not give up so easily. She would continue to enthrall her lover, as she had enthralled him for the past 11 years. Diane's secret weapons were symbols and images to which she had always paid great attention. Early on in her relationship with Henry, she had created a motif by intertwining her initials with his to symbolize their union. The idea worked like a charm. Henry put this insignia everywhere, on his royal robes, on monuments, on churches, on the facade of the Louvre, then the royal palace in Paris. Diane's favorite colors were black and white, which she wore exclusively. And wherever it was possible, the insignia appeared in these colors. Everyone recognized the symbol and its meaning. Soon after Henry took the throne, however, Diane went still further. She decided to identify herself with the Roman goddess Diana, her namesake. Diana was the goddess of the hunt, the traditional royal pastime, and the particular passion of Henry. Equally important, in Renaissance art, she symbolized chastity and purity. For a woman like Diane to identify herself with this goddess would instantly call up those images in the court, giving her an air of respectability. Symbolizing her chaste relationship with Henry, it would also set her apart from the adulterous liaisons of royal mistresses past. To effect this association, Diane began by completely transforming her castle at Anet. She raised the building's structure and in its place erected a magnificent Doric columned edifice modeled after a Roman temple. It was made in white Normandy stone, flecked with black silex, reproducing Diane's trademark colors of black and white. The insignia of her and Henry's initials appeared on the columns, the doors, the windows, the carpet. Meanwhile, symbols of Diana, crescent moons, stags, and hounds, adorned the gates and facade. Inside, enormous tapestries depicting episodes in the life of the goddess lay on the floors and hung on the walls. In the garden stood the famous Goujon sculpture Diane Chasseresse, which is now in the Louvre, and which had an uncanny resemblance to Diane de Poitiers. Paintings and other depictions of Diana appeared in every corner of the castle. Anet overwhelmed Henry, who soon was trumpeting the image of Diane de Poitiers as a Roman goddess. In 1548, when the couple appeared together in Lyon for a royal celebration, the townspeople welcomed them with a tableau vivant depicting a scene with Diana the huntress. France's greatest poet of the period, Pierre de Ronsard, began to write verses in honor of Diana. Indeed, a kind of cult of Diana sprang up, all inspired by the king's mistress. It seemed to Henry that Diane had given herself a kind of divine aura, and as if he were destined to worship her for the rest of his life. And until his death in 1559, he did remain faithful to her, making her a duchess, giving her untold wealth, and displaying an almost religious devotion to his first and only mistress. Interpretation. Diane de Poitiers, a woman from a modest bourgeois background, managed to captivate Henry for over 20 years. By the time she died, she was well into her 60s, yet his passion for her only increased with the years. She knew the king well. He was not an intellectual, but a lover of the outdoors. He particularly loved jousting tournaments with their bright pennants, brilliantly caparisoned horses, and beautifully dressed women. Henry's love of visual splendor seemed childlike to Diane, and she played on this weakness of his at every opportunity. Most astute of all was Diane's appropriation of the goddess Diana. Here, she took the game beyond physical imagery into the realm of the psychic symbol. It was quite a feat to transform a king's mistress into an emblem of power and purity, but she managed it. Without the resonance of the goddess, Diane was merely an aging courtesan. With the imagery and symbolism of Diana on her shoulders, she seemed a mythic force destined for greatness. You too can play with images like these, weaving visual clues into an encompassing gestalt, as Diane did with her colors and her insignia. Establishing a trademark like these to set yourself apart. Then take the game further. Find an image or symbol from the past that will neatly fit your situation and put it on your shoulders like a cape. It will make you seem larger than life. Keys to power. Words put you on the defensive. If you have to explain yourself, your power is already in question. The image, on the other hand, imposes itself as a given. It discourages questions, creates forceful associations, resists unintended interpretations, communicates instantly, and forges bonds that transcend social differences. Words stir up arguments and divisions. Images bring people together. They are the quintessential instruments of power. The symbol has the same force, whether it is visual or a verbal description of something visual. The symbol of the Sun King, as explained by Louis XIV, who is known by that epithet, can be read on many layers, but the beauty of it is that its associations required no explanation, spoke immediately to his subjects, distinguished him from all other kings, and conjured up a kind of majesty that went far beyond the words themselves. The symbol contains untold power. Things change in the game of symbols. It is probably no longer possible to pose as a Sun King or to wrap the mantle of Diana around you. Yet, you can associate yourself with such symbols more indirectly. And, of course, you can make your own mythology out of figures from more recent history. People who are comfortably dead, but still powerfully associative in the public eye. The idea is to give yourself an aura, a stature that your normal banal appearance simply will not create. By herself, Diane de Poitiers had no such radiant powers. She was as human and ordinary as most of us. But the symbol elevated her above the human lot and made her seem divine. Use the power of symbols as a way to rally, animate, and unite your troops or team. Always find a symbol to represent your cause. The more emotional associations, the better. The best way to use images and symbols is to organize them into a grand spectacle that awes people and distracts them from unpleasant realities. This is easy to do. People love what is grand, spectacular, and larger than life. Appeal to their emotions, and they will flock to your spectacle in hordes. The visual is the easiest route to their hearts. Law 38. Think as you like, but behave like others. Judgment. If you make a show of going against the times, flaunting your unconventional ideas and unorthodox ways, people will think that you only want attention and that you look down upon them. They will find a way to punish you for making them feel inferior. It is far safer to blend in and nurture the common touch. Share your originality only with tolerant friends and those who are sure to appreciate your uniqueness.
Good.
Transgression of the law. Around the year 478 BC, the city of Sparta sent an expedition to Persia, led by the young Spartan nobleman Pausanias. The city-states of Greece had recently fought off a mighty invasion from Persia, and now Pausanias, along with allied ships from Athens, had orders to punish the invaders and win back the islands and coastal towns that the Persians had occupied. Both the Athenians and the Spartans had great respect for Pausanias. He had proven himself as a fearless warrior with a flair for the dramatic. With amazing speed, Pausanias and his troops took Cyprus, then moved on to the mainland of Asia Minor known as the Hellespont and captured Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul. Now, master of part of the Persian Empire, Pausanias began to show signs of behavior that went beyond his normal flamboyance. He appeared in public wearing pomade in his hair and flowing Persian robes and accompanied by a bodyguard of Egyptians. He held lavish banquets in which he sat in the Persian manner and demanded to be entertained.
That's a fury.
He stopped seeing his old friends, entered into communication with the Persian king Xerxes, and all in all, affected the style and manner of a Persian dictator. Clearly, power and success had gone to Pausanias' head. His army, Athenians and Spartans alike, at first thought this is a passing fancy. He had always been a bit exaggerated in his gestures, but when he flaunted his disdain for the Greek's simple way of life and insulted the common Greek soldier, they began to feel he had gone too far. Although there was no concrete evidence for this, rumors spread that he had gone over to the other side, and that he dreamed of becoming a kind of Greek Xerxes. To quell the possibility of mutiny, the Spartans relieved Pausanias of his command and called him home. Pausanias, however, continued to dress in the Persian style, even in Sparta. After a few months, he independently hired a trireme and returned to the Hellespont, telling his compatriots he was going to continue the fight against the Persians. Actually, however, he had different plans: to make himself ruler of all Greece with the aid of Xerxes himself. The Spartans declared him a public enemy and sent a ship to capture him. Pausanias surrendered, certain that he could clear himself of the charges of treason. It did come out during the trial that during his reign as commander, he had offended his fellow Greeks time and again, erecting monuments, for instance, in his own name, rather than those of the cities whose troops had fought alongside him, as was the custom. Yet Pausanias proved right. Despite the evidence of his numerous contacts with the enemy, the Spartans refused to imprison a man of such noble birth and let him go. Now thinking himself untouchable, Pausanias hired a messenger to take a letter to Xerxes, but the messenger instead took the letter to the Spartan authorities. These men wanted to find out more, so they had the messenger arrange to meet Pausanias in a temple where they could hide and listen behind a partition. What Pausanias said shocked them. They had never heard such contempt for their ways spoken so brazenly by one of their own, and they made arrangements for his immediate arrest. On his way home from the temple, Pausanias got word of what had happened. He ran to another temple to hide, but the authorities followed him there and placed sentries all around. Pausanias refused to surrender, unwilling to forcibly remove him from the sacred temple. The authorities kept him trapped inside until he eventually died of starvation. Interpretation. At first glance, it might seem that Pausanias simply fell in love with another culture, a phenomenon as old as time. Never comfortable with the asceticism of the Spartans, he found himself enthralled by the Persian love of luxury and sensual pleasure. He put on Persian robes and perfumes with a sense of deliverance from Greek discipline and simplicity. This is how it appears when people adopt a culture in which they were not raised. Often, however, there is also something else at play. People who flaunt their infatuation with a different culture are expressing a disdain and contempt for their own. They are using the outward appearance of the exotic to separate themselves from the common folk who unquestioningly follow the local customs and laws, and to express their sense of superiority. Otherwise, they would act with more dignity, showing respect for those who do not share their desires. Indeed, their need to show their difference so dramatically often makes them disliked by the people whose beliefs they challenge, indirectly and subtly, perhaps, but offensively nonetheless. Cultures have norms that reflect centuries of shared beliefs and ideals. Do not expect to scoff at such things with impunity. You will be punished somehow, even if just through isolation, a position of real powerlessness. Many of us, like Pausanias, feel the siren call of the exotic, the foreign. Measure and moderate this desire. Flaunting your pleasure in alien ways of thinking and acting will reveal a different motive to demonstrate your superiority over your fellows. Keys to power. Wise and clever people learn early on that they can display conventional behavior and mouth conventional ideas without having to believe in them. The power these people gain from blending in is that of being left alone to have the thoughts they want to have, and to express them to the people they want to express them to, without suffering isolation or ostracism. Once they have established themselves in a position of power, they can try to convince a wider circle of the correctness of their ideas, perhaps working indirectly. Make a show of blending in, even going so far as to be the most zealous advocate of the prevailing orthodoxy. If you stick to conventional appearances in public, few will believe you think differently in private. Do not be so foolish as to imagine that in our own time the old orthodoxies are gone. Jonas Salk, for instance, thought science had gotten past politics and protocol, and so, in his search for a polio vaccine, he broke all the rules, going public with the discovery before showing it to the scientific community, taking credit for the vaccine without acknowledging the scientists who had paved the way, making himself a star.
Code.
The public may have loved him, but scientists shunned him. His disrespect for his community's orthodoxies left him isolated, and he wasted years trying to heal the breach and struggling for funding and cooperation. The logical extension of this law is the invaluable ability to be all things to all people. When you go into society, leave behind your own ideas and values, and put on the mask that is most appropriate for the group in which you find yourself. People will swallow the bait because it flatters them to believe that you share their ideas. They will not take you as a hypocrite if you are careful, for how can they accuse you of hypocrisy if you do not let them know exactly what you stand for? Nor will they see you as lacking in values. Of course you have values, the values you share with them while in their company. Law 39. Stir up waters to catch fish. Judgment. Anger and emotion are strategically counterproductive. You must always stay calm and objective. But if you can make your enemies angry while staying calm yourself, you gain a decided advantage. Put your enemies off balance. Find the chink in their vanity through which you can rattle them and you hold the strings. Observance of the law. By the late 1920s, Haile Selassie had nearly achieved his goal of assuming total control over Ethiopia, a country he felt needed strong and unified leadership. As regent to the Empress Zewditu, stepdaughter of the late queen and heir to the throne, Selassie had spent several years weakening the power of Ethiopia's various warlords. Now, only one real obstacle stood in his way: the Empress and her husband, Ras Murdak. Selassie knew the royal couple hated him and wanted to get rid of him. So, to cut short their plotting, he made Gugsa the governor of the northern province of Begemeder, forcing him to leave the capital, where the empress lived. For several years, Gugsa played the loyal administrator, but Selassie did not trust him. He knew that Gugsa and the empress were plotting revenge. As time passed, and Gugsa made no move, the chances of a plot only increased. Selassie knew what he had to do: draw Gugsa out, get under his skin, and push him into action before he was ready. For several years, a northern tribe, the Azibu Galas, had been in virtual rebellion against the throne, robbing and pillaging local villages and refusing to pay taxes. Selassie had done nothing to stop them, letting them grow stronger. Finally, in 1929, he ordered Ras Gugsa to lead an army against these disobedient tribesmen. Gugsa agreed, but inwardly he seethed. He had no grudge against the Azibu Galas, and the demand that he fight them hurt his pride. He could not disobey the order, but as he worked to put together an army, he began to spread an ugly rumor that Selassie was in cahoots with the Pope and planned to convert the country to Roman Catholicism and make it a colony of Italy. Gugsa's armies swelled, and some of the tribes from which his soldiers came secretly agreed to fight Selassie. In March of 1930, an enormous force of 35,000 men began to march, not on the Azibu Galas, but south toward the capital of Addis Ababa. Made confident by his growing strength, Gugsa now openly led a holy war to depose Selassie and put the country back in the hands of true Christians. He did not see the trap that had been laid for him. Before Selassie had ordered Gugsa to fight the Azibu Galas, he had secured the support of the Ethiopian Church. And before the revolt got underway, he had bribed several of Gugsa's key allies not to show up for the battle. As the rebel army marched south, airplanes flew overhead, dropping leaflets announcing that the highest church officials had recognized Selassie as the true Christian leader of Ethiopia, and that they had excommunicated Gugsa for fomenting a civil war.
Code.
These leaflets severely blunted the emotions behind the Holy Crusade. And as battle loomed, and the support that Gugsa's allies had promised him failed to show up, soldiers began to flee or defect. When the battle came, the rebel army quickly collapsed. Refusing to surrender, Ras Gugsa was killed in the fighting. The empress, distraught over her husband's death, died a few days later. On April 30th, Selassie issued a formal proclamation announcing his new title, Emperor of Ethiopia. Interpretation. Haile Selassie always saw several moves ahead. He knew that if he let Ras Gugsa decide the time and place of the revolt, the danger would be much greater than if he forced Gugsa to act on Selassie's terms. So, he goaded him into rebellion by offending his manly pride, asking him to fight people he had no quarrel with on behalf of a man he hated. Thinking everything out ahead, Selassie made sure that Gugsa's rebellion would come to nothing, and that he could use it to do away with his last two enemies. This is the essence of the law. When the waters are still, your opponents have the time and space to plot actions that they will initiate and control. So stir the waters, force the fish to the surface, get them to act before they are ready. Steal the initiative. The best way to do this is to play on uncontrollable emotions: pride, vanity, love, hate. Once the water is stirred up, the little fish cannot help but rise to the bait. The angrier they become, the less control they have, and finally, they are caught in the whirlpool you have made, and they drown. Keys to power. Angry people usually end up looking ridiculous, for their response seems out of proportion to what occasioned it. They have taken things too seriously, exaggerating the hurt or insult that has been done to them. They are so sensitive to slight that it becomes comical how much they take personally. More comical still is their belief that their outbursts signify power. The truth is the opposite. Petulance is not power. It is a sign of helplessness. People may temporarily be cowed by your tantrums, but in the end, they lose respect for you. They also realize they can easily undermine a person with so little self-control. If a person explodes with anger at you, and it seems out of proportion to what you did to them, you must remind yourself that it is not exclusively directed at you. Do not be so vain. The cause is much larger, goes way back in time, involves dozens of prior hurts, and is actually not worth the bother to understand. Instead of seeing it as a personal grudge, look at the emotional outburst as a disguised power move, an attempt to control or punish you, cloaked in the form of hurt feelings and anger. This shift of perspective will let you play the game of power with more clarity and energy. Instead of overreacting and becoming ensnared in people's emotions, You will turn their loss of control to your advantage. You keep your head while they are losing theirs. Once you train yourself not to take matters personally and to control your emotional responses, you will have placed yourself in a position of tremendous power. Now you can play with the emotional responses of other people. Stir the insecure into action by impugning their manhood and by dangling the prospect of an easy victory before their faces. With the arrogant, too, you can appear weaker than you are, taunting them into a rash action. Law 40. Despise the free lunch. Judgment. What is offered for free is dangerous. It usually involves either a trick or a hidden obligation. What has worth is worth paying for. By paying your own way, you stay clear of gratitude, guilt, and deceit. It is also often wise to pay the full price. There is no cutting corners with excellence. Be lavish with your money and keep it circulating, for generosity is a sign and a magnet for power. Money and power. In the realm of power, everything must be judged by its cost, and everything has a price. What is offered for free or at bargain rates often comes with a psychological price tag. Complicated feelings of obligation, compromises with quality, the insecurity those compromises bring, on and on. The powerful learn early to protect their most valuable resources, independence and room to maneuver. By paying the full price, they keep themselves free of dangerous entanglements and worries. Being open and flexible with money also teaches the value of strategic generosity, a variation on the old trick of giving when you are about to take. By giving the appropriate gift, you put the recipient under obligation. Generosity softens people up to be deceived. By gaining a reputation for liberality, you win people's admiration while distracting them from your power plays. By strategically spreading your wealth, you charm the other courtiers, creating pleasure and making valuable allies. Look at the masters of power, the Caesars, the Queen Elizabeths, the Michelangelos, the Medicis. Not a miser among them. Even the great con artists spend freely to swindle. Tight purse strings are unattractive. When engaged in seduction, Casanova would give completely, not only of himself, but of his wallet. The powerful understand that money is psychologically charged, and that it is also a vessel of politeness and sociability. They make the human side of money a weapon in their armory. For everyone able to play with money, thousands more are locked in a self-destructive refusal to use money creatively and strategically. These types represent the opposite pole to the powerful, and you must learn to recognize them, either to avoid their poisonous natures or to turn their inflexibility to your advantage. The greedy fish. The greedy fish take the human side out of money. Cold and ruthless, they see only the lifeless balance sheet, viewing others solely as either pawns or obstructions in their pursuit of wealth. They trample on people's sentiments and alienate valuable allies. No one wants to work with the greedy fish, and over the years they end up isolated, which often proves their undoing. The bargain demon. Powerful people judge everything by what it costs, not just in money, but in time, dignity, and peace of mind. And this is exactly what bargain demons cannot do. Wasting valuable time digging for bargains, they worry endlessly about what they could have gotten elsewhere for a little less. On top of that, the bargain item they do buy is often shabby. Perhaps it needs costly repairs, or will have to be replaced twice as fast as a high-quality item. The costs of these pursuits, not always in money, though the price of a bargain is often deceptive. But in time and peace of mind, discourage normal people from undertaking them. But for the bargain demon, the bargain is an end in itself. These types might seem to harm only themselves, but their attitudes are contagious. Unless you resist them, they will infect you with the insecure feeling that you should have looked harder to find a cheaper price. Don't argue with them or try to change them. Just mentally add up the cost in time and inner peace, if not in hidden financial expense, of the irrational pursuit of a bargain. The sadist. Financial sadists play vicious power games with money as a way of asserting their power. They might, for example, make you wait for money that is owed you, promising that the check is in the mail. Or, if they hire you to work for them, they meddle in every aspect of the job, haggling and giving you ulcers. Sadists seem to think that paying for something gives them the right to torture and abuse the seller. They have no sense of the courtier element in money. If you are unlucky enough to get involved with this type, accepting a financial loss may be better in the long run than getting entangled in their destructive power games. The indiscriminate giver. Generosity has a definite function in power. It attracts people, softens them up, makes allies out of them. But it has to be used strategically with a definite end in mind. Indiscriminate givers, on the other hand, are generous because they want to be loved and admired by all. And their generosity is so indiscriminate and needy that it may not have the desired effect. If they give to one and all, why should the recipient feel special? Attractive as it may seem to make an indiscriminate giver your mark, in any involvement with this type, you will often feel burdened by their insatiable emotional needs. Transgression of the law. In the early 18th century, no one stood higher in English society than the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough. The Duke, having led successful campaigns against the French, was considered Europe's premier general and strategist. And his wife, the Duchess, after much maneuvering, had established herself as the favorite of Queen Anne, who became ruler of England in 1702. In 1704, the Duke's triumph at the Battle of Blenheim made him the toast of England, and to honor him, the Queen awarded him a large plot of land in the town of Woodstock, and the funds to create a great palace there. Calling his planned home the Palace of Blenheim, the Duke chose as his architect the young John Vanbrugh, a kind of Renaissance man who wrote plays as well as designed buildings. And so construction began in the summer of 1705, with much fanfare and great hopes. Vanbrugh had a dramatist's sense of architecture. His palace was to be a monument to Marlborough's brilliance and power, and was to include artificial lakes, enormous bridges, elaborate gardens, and other fantastical touches. From day one, however, the Duchess could not be pleased. She thought Vanbrugh was wasting money on yet another stands of trees. She wanted the palace finished as soon as possible. The Duchess tortured Vanbrugh and his workmen on every detail. She was consumed with petty matters. Although the government was paying for Blenheim, she counted every penny. Eventually, her grumbling about Blenheim and other things too created an irreparable rift between her and Queen Anne, who, in 1711, dismissed her from the court, ordering her to vacate her apartments at the royal palace. When the Duchess left, fuming over the loss of her position, and also of her royal salary, she emptied the apartment of every fixture down to the brass doorknobs. Over the next 10 years, work on Blenheim would stop and start as the funds became harder to procure from the government. The Duchess thought Vanbrugh was out to ruin her. She quibbled over every carload of stone and bushel of lime, counted every extra yard of iron railing or foot of wainscot, hurling abuse at the wasteful workmen, contractors, and surveyors. Marlborough, old and weary, wanted nothing more than to settle into the palace in his last years. But the project became bogged down in a swamp of litigation. The workmen suing the Duchess for wages, the Duchess suing the architect right back. In the midst of this interminable wrangling, the Duke died. He had never spent a night in his beloved Blenheim. After Marlborough's death, it became clear that he had a vast estate, worth over £2 million, more than enough to pay for finishing the palace. But the Duchess would not relent. She held back Van Brugh's wages as well as the workmen's, and finally had the architect dismissed. The man who took his place finished Blenheim in a few years, following Van Brugh's designs to the letter. Van Brugh died in 1726, locked out of the palace by the Duchess, unable to set foot in his greatest creation. Foreshadowing the Romantic movement, Blenheim had started a whole new trend in architecture, but had given its creator a 20-year nightmare. Interpretation. For the Duchess of Marlborough, money was a way to play sadistic power games. She saw the loss of money as a symbolic loss of power. With Van Brugh, her contortions went deeper still. He was a great artist, and she envied his power to create, to attain a fame outside her reach. She may not have had his gifts, but she did have the money to torture and abuse him over the pettiest details, to ruin his life. This kind of sadism, however, bears an awful price. It made construction that should have lasted 10 years take 20. It poisoned many a relationship, alienated the Duchess from the court, deeply pained the Duke, who wanted only to live peacefully in Blenheim, created endless lawsuits, and took years off Van Brugh's life. Finally, too, posterity had the last word. Van Brugh is recognized as a genius, while the Duchess is forever remembered for her consummate cheapness. The powerful must have grandeur of spirit. They can never reveal any pettiness. And money is the most visible arena in which to display either grandeur or pettiness. Best spend freely then, and create a reputation for generosity, which in the end will pay great dividends. Never let financial details blind you to the bigger picture of how people perceive you. Their resentment will cost you in the long run, and if you want to meddle in the work of creative people under your hire, at least pay them well. Your money will buy their submission better than your displays of power. Law 41. Avoid stepping into a great man's shoes. Judgment. What happens first always appears better and more original than what comes after. If you succeed a great man or have a famous parent, you will have to accomplish double their achievements to outshine them. Do not get lost in their shadow or stuck in a past not of your own making. Establish your own name and identity by changing course. Slay the overbearing father, disparage his legacy, and gain power by shining in your own way. Observance of the law. Alexander the Great had a dominant passion as a young man, an intense dislike for his father, King Philip of Macedonia. He hated Philip's cunning, cautious style of ruling, his bombastic speeches, his drinking and whoring, and his love of wrestling and of other wastes of time. Alexander knew he had to make himself the very opposite of his domineering father. He would force himself to be bold and reckless. He would control his tongue and be a man of few words, and he would not lose precious time in pursuit of pleasures that brought no glory. Alexander also resented the fact that Philip had conquered most of Greece. "My father will go on conquering till there is nothing extraordinary left for me to do," he once complained. While other sons of powerful men were content to inherit wealth and live a life of leisure, Alexander wanted only to outdo his father, to obliterate Philip's name from history by surpassing his accomplishments. Alexander itched to show others how superior he was to his father. A Thessalian horse dealer once brought a prize horse named Bucephalus to sell to Philip. None of the king's grooms could get near the horse. It was far too savage, and Philip berated the merchant for bringing him such a useless beast. Watching the whole affair, Alexander scowled and commented, "What a horse they are losing for want of skill and spirit to manage him." When he had said this several times, Philip finally had enough and challenged him to take on the horse. He called the merchant back, secretly hoping his son would have a nasty fall and learn a bitter lesson. But Alexander was the one to teach the lesson. Not only did he mount Bucephalus, he managed to ride him at full gallop, taming the horse that would later carry him all the way to India. The courtiers applauded wildly, but Philip seethed inside, seeing not a son, but a rival to his power. Alexander's defiance of his father grew bolder. One day the two men had a heated argument before the entire court, and Philip drew his sword as if to strike his son. Having drunk too much wine, however, the king stumbled. Alexander pointed at his father and jeered, "Men of Macedonia, see there the man who is preparing to pass from Europe to Asia? He cannot pass from one table to another without falling." When Alexander was 18, a disgruntled courtier murdered Philip. As word of the regicide spread through Greece, city after city rose up in rebellion against their Macedonian rulers. Philip's advisors counseled Alexander, now the king, to proceed cautiously, to do as Philip had done and conquer through cunning. But Alexander would do things his way. He marched to the furthest reaches of the kingdom, suppressed the rebellious towns, and reunited the empire with brutal efficiency. As a young rebel grows older, his struggle against the father often wanes, and he gradually comes to resemble the very man he wanted to defy. But Alexander's loathing of his father did not end with Philip's death. Once he had consolidated Greece, he set his eyes on Persia, the prize that had eluded his father, who had dreamed of conquering Asia. If he defeated the Persians, Alexander would finally surpass Philip in glory and fame. Alexander crossed into Asia with an army of 35,000 to face a Persian force numbering over 1,000,000. Before engaging the Persians in battle, he passed through the town of Gordium. Here, in the town's main temple, there stood an ancient chariot tied with cords made of the rind of the cornel tree. Legend had it that any man who could undo these cords, the Gordian knot, would rule the world. Many had tried to untie the enormous and intricate knot, but none had succeeded. Alexander, seeing he could not possibly untie the knot with his bare hands, took out his sword and with one slash cut it in half. This symbolic gesture showed the world that he would not do as others, but would blaze his own path. Against astounding odds, Alexander conquered the Persians. Most expected him to stop there. It was a great triumph, enough to secure his fame for eternity. But Alexander had the same relationship to his own deeds as he had to his father. His conquest of Persia represented the past, and he wanted never to rest on past triumphs, or to allow the past to outshine the present. He moved on to India, extending his empire beyond all known limits. Only his disgruntled and weary soldiers prevented him from going further. Interpretation. Alexander represents an extremely uncommon type in history. The son of a famous and successful man who manages to surpass the father in glory and power. The reason this type is uncommon is simple. The father most often manages to amass his fortune, his...
Yeah, I'm going to elaborate upon the liar. You know about say Alexander the Great, Zin? You know, so him revolutionize the Jesus Christ, and he's the one responsible for creating the cross as a symbol. Yeah? But look how pure and natural him grow. Him father the king, and instead of strive to be the king, don't be surprised if I don't plot for killing one of father. Because whatever inside him as a young child, he destined to be greater than his father, and he don't want to walk in his father's shoes neither. So that man was created outside of greatness, and look what he give to the whole world, the universe. by suppressing his thoughts and his ideas and make sure so they manifest any means necessary. So see the 48 law power, it not only I tell you the law them, it explain say it the cause effect and use certain historian marking spot like powerful things will happen throughout earth. So you can recognize that the law really work. So when you master them law, you can apply it to your life with a balance. You see me? So Alexander the Great that him I tell you about. Them man they no normal. You see me? Probably one of them there we can like study something for Alexander the Great. Enough people hear that they don't know who is Alexander the Great really and Julie. But them man they're powerful has a lot to do with the history of the Adamites, you know. Them thing they don't have, you know. Alexander the Great. Yeah, the man named Alexander the Great. Great in father, never have great pan in name, you know. So it has said, never walk in a king's shoes. Yeah, man, be patient. Patient. And work on your thing. Because you have to be greater than the man where they're in front of you, you know. So that's why any man who say them are the greatest, them violate the law of the universe. Because there's nothing at all that you can think of where you can get in abundance. It's only your mind limit you to where you want to go. Your mind not create limited, but you have to limit yourself. Yeah, man, Alexander the Great are one of them great one there too. You see me?
Kingdom, because he begins with little or nothing. A desperate urge impels him to succeed. He has nothing to lose by cunning and impetuousness, and has no famous father of his own to compete against. This kind of man has reason to believe in himself, to believe that his way of doing things is the best, because, after all, it worked for him. When a man like this has a son, he becomes domineering and oppressive, imposing his lessons on the son who is starting off life in circumstances totally different from those in which the father himself began. The sons of such men tend to become cowed and cautious, terrified of losing what their fathers have gained. The son will never step out of his father's shadow unless he adopts the ruthless strategy of Alexander. Disparage the past, create your own kingdom, put the father in the shadows instead of letting him do the same to you. If you cannot materially start from ground zero, it would be foolish to renounce an inheritance. You can at least begin from ground zero psychologically by throwing off the weight of the past and charting a new direction. Alexander instinctively recognized that privileges of birth are impediments to power. Be merciless with the past then, not only with your father and his father, but with your own earlier achievements. Only the weak rest on their laurels and dote on past triumphs. In the game of power, there is never time to rest. Keys to power. Power depends on the ability to fill a void, to occupy a field that has been cleared of the dead weight of the past. Only after the father figure has been properly done away with, will you have the necessary space to create and establish a new order. There are several strategies you can adopt to accomplish this. Perhaps the simplest way to escape the shadow of the past is simply to belittle it, playing on the timeless antagonism between the generations, stirring up the young against the old. For this, you need a convenient older figure to pillory. John F. Kennedy knew the dangers of getting lost in the past. He radically distinguished his presidency from that of his predecessor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and also from the preceding decade, the 1950s, which Eisenhower personified. Kennedy, for instance, would not play the dull and fatherly game of golf, a symbol of retirement and privilege, and Eisenhower's passion. Instead, he played football on the White House lawn. In every aspect, his administration represented vigor and youth, as opposed to the stodgy Eisenhower. Kennedy had discovered an old truth. The young are easily set against the old, since they yearn to make their own place in the world and resent the shadow of their fathers. Never let yourself be seen as following your predecessor's path. If you do, You will never surpass him. You must physically demonstrate your difference by establishing a style and symbolism that sets you apart. When General Douglas MacArthur assumed command of American forces in the Philippines during World War II, an assistant handed him a book containing the various precedents established by the commanders before him, the methods that had been successful for them. MacArthur asked the assistant how many copies there were of this book. 6, the assistant answered. Well, the general replied, you get all those 6 copies together and burn them, every one of them. I'll not be bound by precedents. Anytime a problem comes up, I'll make the decision at once, immediately. Adopt this ruthless strategy toward the past, burn all the books, and train yourself to react to circumstances as they happen. You may believe that you have separated yourself from the predecessor or father figure, but as you grow older, you must be eternally vigilant, lest you become the father you have rebelled against. Finally, plenitude and prosperity tend to make us lazy and inactive. When our power is secure, we have no need to act. This is a serious danger, especially for those who achieve success and power at an early age. You must be prepared to return to square one psychologically, rather than growing fat and lazy with prosperity.
Good.
Pablo Picasso could deal with success, but only by constantly changing the style of his painting, often breaking completely with what had made him successful before. How often our early triumphs turn us into a kind of caricature of ourselves. Powerful people recognize these traps. Like Alexander the Great, they struggle constantly to recreate themselves. The father must not be allowed to return. He must be slain at every step of the way.
Not physically. You see me?
Law 40.
Not physically. You see me? So that me I say the people when we use the law, some of them misuse the law by do it physically. You see what I say? Because you have them a young Alexander snake and wait for them father dead. From them father all, them carry them go put out what they call the homes. You understand me I say? From them parents I get home, them Adamites and no love for them mother and father from them reach certain age brethren. Then put them in a home sometime, pay all the nurse them, for starve them to death so they can hurry up, get the wealth, for do whatever they want. That's why I say some of the laws them when you listen, you have to study them with a moderation. You don't do the definite thing. You just want to know the power and the codes them where the other mites them are use out there in the world. And you know say you have some pitney same way where them father do a business and they not even want 10 cents from them daddy. They want to grow up and work and build for them own thing. Now walk under the shadow of them father, then a response for no daddy foundation. Rebellious. Do anything David us all spiteful do things to mush up them father business and name and reputation. To build for himself. So power without control is danger. Power without control is danger. Fascination with a dream, earnestly don't want to wait on the time for it manifest is danger. I saw some of them could pick me a stay. They go me and say that's why you have to know the ways of how these people think from then until now. You see me? So you can truly stand up in the earth on your foot and fully grounded. Yeah, man. So the last law that for tonight, I just finish the rest of them tomorrow. You over so me I say, you don't know family time and you don't know you can violate family time. So me I say, so give thanks to the years and give thanks to the one them where and listen, as me I say, you can't get it one time when you listen, do yourself a favor if you can't get the book for read itself, or if you want to listen to audio on YouTube, 48 Law Power, find a quiet place, undisturbed, do this for your own self, And if you can't, some people can't get it when them listen it one time. Some people have to listen it over and over and over again. For me, how me trick the law, me read it first, then listen it. Once you read it first and listen it, you can't come out of it. Because you visualize the words while listening the audio. You see me? Power that. So power without control is danger. No create nothing where you can't control, brother. It make no sense. You dig what me say? So, sisters and brothers of light, of the light, radiance of balance, welcome to the power of the universe or the whole of the leaders of the world I use. Get it for yourself, unlock the code, so we can have a better life experience within the realms of reality. Yeah? Yeah, man. Give thanks, yeah? Tomorrow again, we're out and stunning.